it's interesting too to think about like how you start your day sort of in the stomach hours, right? Like,
what hours are those?
it's like 7 to 9.
Uh-huh.
Right. I have to do it in my head really fast. 7 to 9 and then 9 to 11.
Fire. The fire phase lives in the heart. What do we mean by the fire phase? Well, through its association with the heart, we can think first and foremost of the quality or the character of light that emerges from a fire as contrasted with heat. And the association we make with that is with consciousness. The fundamental fire which burns in our bodies is consciousness. In the third of the 13 treatises, the professor writes about the special characteristic of Taiji Chuan. Its ability to put the mind and qi in the dantian. Well, to understand what he's getting at, you have to appreciate the 5-phase relationship between the heart and the kidney. And if you grasp the meaning and the way of meaning of this particular metaphor, it really helps clarify this whole set of issues. What is the kidney? Water, the water phase. What is the heart? Fire. Fire is pure yang. Its nature is to rise up and go out. Water is pure yin. Its nature is to sink. The movements of these two are contrary. And indeed, a lifetime could be defined as that span of time, that moment in which the temporarily united yin and yang go their separate ways. So what is the professor saying? The life cultivation work of Taiji consists of reversing that natural tendency. We know, speaking of predicting patterns, we know that left to its own devices, this temporary amalgamation of yin and yang will separate. Separation of yin and yang in this context means death. One of the anonymous Tai Chi classics ends with the lines that say, think over carefully what the final purpose is, to lengthen life and maintain youth. Youth. So if you want that, what do? Take the natural proclivity of yang and yin to throughout the span of your life move to separate and reverse it. Put the yang under the yin. Use the heat of the yang to warm the cold of the yin. What then is created is qi. But this is a qi which doesn't exist outside of this specific activity. It's as distinct as the gold coming out of the collision of neutron stars.
So this is a very specific form of qi among all the different forms of qi that you have talked about.
Exactly. This is the qi of cultivation.
So am I right in thinking that every moment we're consciously putting our mind in qi and dantian, we're raising qi a little bit by putting that heart fire under the kidneys?
Precisely so. You know, we talk about the health benefits of Tai Chi. Probably the greatest benefit available from the practice of Tai Chi is what you just said. The more you practice, the more you have. Storing it up. Not the only benefit, but perhaps the greatest. And among Tai Chi students, it's probably the most commonly overlooked. People want to know where the hand goes, where the foot goes. Where the mind goes, and to the dantian.
That's true.
Just that it works, right?
Just that it's like an observation.
The sequence of the generative cycle of the 5 phases has changed. Throughout history, it has changed. One of the ways in which this theory has found application in Chinese life has been the process of dynastic succession, according to the basic principle that the next dynasty should be of the child element. So that if the current dynasty is fire, then the next dynasty should be of the earth. Well, guess what? There have been times when the upcoming dynastic family wasn't the right element. What do? They changed the sequence.
I thought you were going to say they tried to change their element.
So the element is dominant over the sequence in this case?
The important point to take away from that is the flexibility of Chinese theoretical structure. What makes it flexible is that it has no linkage with truth. Rather, it's linked to efficacy.
Like theory of relativity more. It's like more relative.
You know, I am pretending to understand this.
How's that working out?
Not very well. I don't see how you, okay, the new dynasty comes in, they arbitrarily change the sequence, but things flow the way they flow.
The sequence could still be the same, but you just start in a different place.
Is that what it is?
If it's a cycle, and,
Uh-huh.
and instead of being wood, you decide it's going to be metal, the sequence would still go on from there.
No, I think they drew a new map.
It was changed.
The element was changed.
Let me see if I can
Okay.
address your conundrum. Richard Feynman, the American physicist, once famously said that nature does not care what we call it. Here's the truth about the universe. Whatever happens, happens. We come along with our anthropocentric view of things, and we construct these elaborate conceptual models based not on how the world is, but on how we are.
So anthropomorphizing nature, calling it a god or gods, is what we're talking about here. Based on elaborate and structural models based on how we are. But nature continues to do whatever it does, no matter what belief system we impose on it.
Exactly. We think the world looks a certain way, but that's because of the portion of the electromagnetic spectrum that we're sensitive to and responsive to. We don't see things that we don't have the perceptual tools to see, let alone the cognitive tools to think about. The mass of our brain, the mass of neurons in our brains, defines the way we'll see the world. It's different for us than other primates, or for different mammals, and you can't think thoughts that your equipment won't think.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of the arguments for artificial intelligence. Of course, artificial intelligence can surpass natural human intelligence because you can build a machine that doesn't have these limitations. It's got different limitations.
So a dolphin, with their sonar, they can be face-to-face with another organism, even one like us that's a different species, and know, for instance, that the female is pregnant or not because of the sonar waves bouncing. And that's a perception we don't.
There's a good example of hardware limitations.
Yeah.
What's important to understand are the patterns of associations. And that way of thinking and using theory to think. The Chinese had this largely through the agency of five-phase theory. They had what I think of as a distributed theory of mind. Modern people think of mind as one thing, body as another thing, and that the two represent some sort of duality. The ancient Chinese concept is somewhat different than that. The cognitive affect, as well as the emotional affect of the body, was not conceived of as existing in one remote location, inside the skull, for example. Rather, it was seen to reside throughout the body, according to that same pattern of associations of internal organs and five faces. So now we can revisit that map. We'll start with the liver. the wood phase. What aspect of mind is associated with this? Well, as I described it, pathologically, we think of it as frustration. Meaning what? Meaning what happens when the immovable object encounters the irresistible force? That is frustration. The theory then suggests that this kind of situation potentially challenges the liver.
Mm-hmm.
What is the liver responsible for in normal physiology? The free flowing of qi. My favorite poetic expression of this is that Dylan Thomas phrase, the force that through the green fuse drives the flower.
Say that again?
The force that through the green fuse drives the flower. It's the name of a poem by Dylan Thomas. This is the wood phase. The wood phase is the force that through the green fuse drives the flower. Well, when that force is stopped, you get pathological creation. Distortion of that force results in pathologies.
Example.
Well, emotional frustration and its descendants.
Mm-hmm. Such as outbursts of anger that are larger than the triggering situation would really warrant because there's so much backed up.
Exactly. Such as stroke. Such as red eyes. Such as dizziness.
Mm.
There's a whole range of clinical situations which we associate with that basic understanding. What happens to kidneys when they experience too much stimulation? What is the emotion of fear? What is the emotion of the kidneys? Fear. What happens when the kidneys are overwhelmed? That fear becomes predominant. And what do people do in this situation? They pee in their pants. There's a physiological expression of that association. One thing that's important in using these theories clinically is to understand their somatic value. And we'll keep talking about fear for the moment to illustrate what I'm talking about. Often people will show up in the clinic with a complaint related to fear. It's very important that your inquiry and investigation about this not stop at the level of the words, but get to the level of the actual feelings. A patient comes in and says that she's troubled by fear. What is the trouble? What happens when you have this trouble? And we discover people feel fear differently. This opens a very important door to the whole area of the difference between emotions and feelings. So back to our patient who's trouble with fear. What does fear feel like? For some people, fear feels stiff. They get rigid, frozen with fear. For some people, fear is that downward releasing of bladder and bowel. For some people, fear is in the heart, fluttery. So in fact, we find that clinically, the experience of fear can relate to different organ systems.
I don't want to pull us off subject, but because of the fires, I imagine everybody working in the clinic is dealing with patients who are reacting to that. Is there something specific we should be thinking about because of that? There's a tremendous amount of fear, and you're saying it's going to manifest differently in different people.
You know, practically speaking, because of our geographic relationship with the fires, the biggest thing that we've had to contend with is air quality.
Yeah.
And the challenge that the smoke represents to the lungs. You know, it's a whole big subject, and if we shift onto it, we will have just done what you said you didn't want to do.
Okay, that's already useful.
So can we go through, these you kind of gave 3 different ways that people could feel fear. And then you said based on how they're feeling it, it could be a different organ system or phase. Do those each have a specific one they point to?
Mm-hmm. The experience of fear, which makes you feel frozen, points to the liver.
The movement is restricted. The movement is like stifled, restricted.
The body feels wooden.
Mm-hmm.
The experience of fear, which is that downward releasing, suggests kidney.
And heart fluttery.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is like super off topic, but what about like confusion? Because I feel like sometimes there's an aspect of confusion, like the body has a response, and there's like a confusion, inability to like fully understand, that creates sort of like this discord or like. I heard in a lecture once that like one of the benefits of like doing the I Ching is that it treats confusion because it gives you a little bit of insight that calms that energy. But I never knew like what is that energy? Why does confusion get mixed into things?
Reality is a synthetic thing. We manufacture it. And confusion itself, especially intense confusion, can challenge the way in which you manufacture your reality. You know, living, surviving is an effort. The young thinks it just happens. But after you've been at it for a while, you realize it's an act of will. Confusion can confound the will. It can dissolve the will. Because the will, the expression and the manifestation of will requires some degree of certainty, the opposite of confusion. If everything's confused, it's hard to set your sights. So the experience of confusion it can dissolve the will. Military planners use that kind of dynamic on the battlefield. Sometimes far more effective than bullets and bombs is information. Confuse the enemy. Think about our current political situation.
Boom. Confusion.
We've become confused.
Yeah, because even the news is now, people are noticing, is not even giving real news.
Or like, that's the strategy, is to make us think everything's going to be confused.
Yeah.
Not sure if we can trust it.
If this is the result of Russian meddling, the most important thing to recognize at this point is that it worked. They didn't attempt to do something, they did it. As a martial artist, I've always found it very important to acknowledge when you've been hit.
Again, not wanting to pull us too far off, but you know, in 1984, in the book within the book in 1984, it says very clearly that governments, the war of governments is not against each other, but each government is at war against its own people. And the best strategy is confusion, keep people confused. So it didn't start with the current administration, though they're very good at it. Confused and frightened.
The media presents itself as if its product is information. The media's product is attention management. The media is used by those people who operate it to direct the public's attention to and away from. That's what it does.
Yeah, I actually listened to a lecture that talked about the hyper-reality is becoming more real than reality. Like, you on the news watch a few explosions in a war, now everyone's created this hyper-reality that that's the war more so than the actual event that's going on.
And hyper-reality would mean what?
I don't really know.
Okay.
I can send you the lecture. It's like an old lecture.
The exaggeration of certain attention-catching qualities, maybe?
I guess I understood hyper-reality as like a
More so, yeah.
yeah, it's like a reality that's like created and constructed.
Okay.
But I mean, from what you're saying, reality is already synthetic.
That's why it works.
Yeah.
It's not that the people are doing one thing and the media is doing something else. Everybody's always doing the same thing. They're trying to make up the story of their reality. But the media, what I'm saying is, the media doesn't care about creating a reality. All the media cares about is what are you paying attention to. too. The product of media is your eyeballs. Where do you have them focused? This is the view of human beings as commodities. This is important to realize about your patients as well. Your patients are modern people. Modern people are economic units. We have a certain cost, we have a certain earning potential. The concept of the modern self and the ancient concept of self are two completely different things.
Can you say a little bit about that?
This modern homo commodification needs to earn a living.
Mm-hmm.
What do you ask when you meet someone? What do you do? What do you do is the short form of asking, how do you sell your labor? Where do you fit in the commodity reality? Well, that's a pretty modern thing.
Whereas, am I right, in the ancient Chinese sense of self, it's very much involved in family?
Well, family and social. Where are you in the social hierarchy?
Ah, okay.
Are you a peasant? Are you a slave? Are you a prisoner? Are you in the army? Are you a merchant? The role and realization of the self as an individual in Chinese life was always an expression of its place in the hierarchy. Pecking order.
I mean, it's kind of similar. Because, like, if you're an army, that's what you do. If you're a merchant, that's what you do. If you're a peasant, farmer.
When Chinese meet each other in that ancient or traditional,
They don't ask, what do you do?
they want to know, where are you from?
And does that tell them about your social standing then?
It tells you something about the nature of social standing. The Chinese bond with the earth is very potent in that sense of social being. The Chinese up until today have a system known as household registry, Fuko. When you are born, you are registered with your local police department. You have an identity card. And that identity card documents and virtually bestows upon you your rights as a citizen. If your Fuko is in Sichuan, you may not live in Beijing. You can live where you're registered. You're you of a place. Every spring festival, Chinese New Year, Chinese traditionally travel back to their hometown. This is celebration and respect for this basic connection that people have to the earth. And not to the earth as an abstract idea, but to that spot of earth on which you were born, in which your ancestors are buried, and on which you survive.
What does that mean if you immigrated somewhere and were born somewhere different from where your ancestors are from?
Well, it means that next time it's Spring Festival, you got to go home.
Which home? The ancestor home?
Yeah. Now, on top of all kinds of concerns and considerations like this, is this enormous pragmatism that Chinese culture has engendered amongst its numbers. So that at the end of that, you have to go home is a comma, if and as possible. The Chinese move to a new place, and what's important is to sing the local tune. The Chinese are great adopters of their new cultural set. They join local churches, they become involved in local politics. Because their philosophical view provides them with the understanding that everything changes, that nature does not care what we call it. And what's important about your capacity to adapt is your capacity to adapt to your current situation. Doesn't do you any good to do as your ancestors did. They're dead. To a certain extent, the past consumed itself, and this is our opportunity not to make those same mistakes. But that's a process which is guided by the restraint of accumulated knowledge. The classics, in other words. The transmission of vital information. Anyway, I fear we may have been a bit too discursive here this afternoon, but I wanted to give you this sense of not just five phases theory, but how five phases theory theory more or less represents the end of the most basic fundamental notions. Taiji, yin yang, qi, Tao, Sishi.
What's the last one?
4 seasons.
Seshi, 4 seasons.
And now 5 phases. Now we've got more or less adequate theory to explain the self and its fundamental constituents, its fundamental components. And we're ready to move on. At the next table. So I stood up and I started to sing. Allons enfants de la patrie. Oh well.